And welcome back to what was formerly known as Darts News Weekly. Not so much sure that's the case anymore, but we're here to discuss the lineup for the 2021 Premier League and try and fill that final spot. 9 names already confirmed. I've got to say, I think probably all the 9 names are the ones you would have expected coming off the back of the World Championships. I'm sure, looking at your face, Sam, you'll have some gripes with a couple of them. But starting off with the obvious ones, I think Michael Van Gerwen, Peter Wright, Gerwin Price are all complete shoo-ins. I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, and even had Rob Cross to that as well, who I'm guessing you'll touch on. Of course, it's kind of 3 names that pick themselves due to the ranking, of course, but also the stature. I'd also throw even the likes of Gary Anderson into that. He always gets in, even if he was like 40 odd in the world, he'd get him. So ultimately, it's a Premier League this year that, although the lineup there's been a few complaints with it, and I'm one of them who believes that certain aspects of the lineup aren't great, but considering we've had multiple major winners this year as well, you can't really complain about the lineup too much, barring a few obvious gripes, I'd say.
The Rob Cross one, because it's just because of the top four. The top four automatic picks, as we know, and Rob Cross has somehow hung on to that last spot. And to be honest, if you look at the 1 year order of merit, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe he's around 21st, 22nd in the 1 year order of merit, which is not good for a player of his ability. But because Gerwin Price defeated Gary Anderson in the World Championship final, if it was the other way around, of course, Cross would have slipped to number 5, and then you've got to say he probably wouldn't have been a pick for the Premier League. But it's a huge lifeline for him, and it's he's not played well this year. We know that, but with the way the rankings are, there's a possibility. There's a possibility that because he's been given this chance that he probably doesn't deserve, he may come out fighting next year, and you've got to hope so, really, because it's not been a good year for Rob Cross.
I'd say yes and no with that. He was kind of given the opportunity last year as well, because he wasn't really, off the back of his World Match Play and European Championship win, he wasn't playing that great going into last year's Premier League, to be honest. And even more so, of course, personal circumstances were an issue for him last year. He had a family member sadly pass away due to coronavirus. So that kind of could have played a factor in his game. I wouldn't really say he's going to seize onto that lifeline. I don't think barring a few tournaments where he's performed okay and has been shown some of the averages he used to produce. I'd say towards the end of the year he was at times firing on all cylinders on the Pro Tour. But of course at the World Championship, although against an opponent like Dirk Van Dyken, who it's another case of his ranking not showing where he is in the world. He kind of had a bit of a tough draw there, and it'll be interesting to see. But ultimately, for me, and one of the main gripes I've got with this year's Premier League is, of course, you have to pick players like Cross, but matches like Cross Vandenberg, Cross Aspinall, in my opinion, don't really thrill me. And so an overhaul in the future might be needed for the Premier League, because ultimately you're always going to pick a certain amount of players. You're always going to pick your Michael Van Gerwens, your Gerwin Prices, your Peter Wrights, even the major winners. But ultimately it's going to get to the point where of course you'll have that one of those matches a night. You'll always have a Van Gerwen Price or a Van Gerwen Anderson, but then again, going down a bit like a boxing card, you'll always have one fight which is great, and then the undercard is a bit, at times, depending on who it is, it can be a bit stale or full of mismatches. And at times, I think the Premier League's going to become that this year. I think it's a point I've made previously about the top 3 pulling away, and a bit like tennis. In my opinion, we're going to get that now, especially if crowds return. We're going to get Van Gerwen, Price and Wright kind of pulling away. You might see the likes of Anderson, if he's actually fit, join that group. But it's an interesting time for darts as a whole and for the Premier League. And in my opinion, it'll be a big measuring stick when it does start to see about the future of the top 10 and the Premier League as a whole this year. I think it's quite a pivotal year.
Yeah, I think it is a pivotal year, and you've got obviously 2 debutants in this year's Premier League in the shape of Jose de Sousa and Dimitri Vandenberg, both major winners. both Sky Sports major winners as well, which I'm sure was a fairly big
Yeah.
turning point in terms of the picks. As we know, they get a couple of picks themselves. Players that probably deserve to be there. Dimitri Vandenberg's had a splendid year. He looked great at the match play, obviously. Performed very well in the group stages, at least, of the Grand Slam of darts. And at times in the World Championship as well, was very unfortunate to lose out, you could say, to a fired up Dave Professor Chisnell. And then Jose de Souza, a player that's performed well for a couple of years now, maybe gone a little bit off the boil since his Grand Slam win, but you've got to say in those short races, be first to 7 in the Premier League, you've got to give him a chance with the scoring power he can produce. Probably one of the biggest scorers in the world at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. He's one of the picks that I'm a fan of personally. Of course, Dimmy's had a great year, but he can produce on the big stage, but he could also slow it down quite a lot and be quite a methodical player. We ended up seeing that at the Grand Slam, that he's very much, he can slow the game down when he wants, he can play fast when he wants, he can produce when he wants. But whether it's going to, a bit like I said, with the Premier League as a whole, it's going to be a measuring stick. And we've seen it for Kim Heidbrecks, Robert Thornton, etc. Robert Thornton, a multiple major winner, who, of course, has fallen down in darts as a whole since his Premier League appearance. Jelle Klassen's another one who's kind of had his shot in the Premier League. He's had multiple shots and has not really capitalised on that. And in my opinion, it's going to be interesting to see if Dimmy and Jose actually establish themselves as Premier League forerunners going forward, because, of course, we saw last year Glenn Durrant and Nathan Aspinall as debutants made it all the way to the final, and Glenn, of course, ended up winning the title. And it's the reason why Aspinall, in my opinion, is in this year, because otherwise I wouldn't give the spot to Aspinall, and you know that more than anyone. It's my opinion that he hasn't been great for quite a while. And that Premier League finals night, as we know, with the aftermath of Glenn Durrant's season with coronavirus, he could have had it then. Probably not, but he wasn't at his best. Neither was Aspinall. Neither was Wright. He was probably the worst we've seen him in 2020. And, of course, Anderson was there as well. So it was an interesting Premier League for an interesting year, but ultimately he got Aspinall his spot for this year. And it's going to be make or break for him this year as well, in my opinion, because as much as he's kind of established himself among the darting elite now, as much as it's without crowds, he's a player who thrives on it compared to others who potentially have taken advantage of it this year. And it'll be interesting to see the likes of Dirk Van Dyken and Devin Peterson and see if they can reproduce with crowds again when they do come back. But it'll be interesting with Aspinall to see if he can get to the final again if we do have crowds, which by the looks of things with the delay, it's what they're hoping for. But yeah, it's good to see Dimmy and Jose in the Premier League. In another year, you potentially have at least 4 or 5 spots free. But of course, major winners to kind of pit themselves, especially as you say, with them being Sky Sports major winners. They kind of have to be up there, and they're in the Premier League this year.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned with Nathan Aspinall, I think all the players you can look at and you can say they're either top elite players, the ones we've mentioned, or they're players that have got things to build on. The likes of your De Sousas, the likes of your Vandenbergs, even your Glenn Durrant, he's got plenty to build on. He's got, although he's defending next year, he's probably a better player than he was 2 years ago in terms of experience in the PDC, and you expect him to reproduce those performances now as a top 10 player. But with Nathan Aspinall, he's got a lot to lose in the coming year, and with his performance in the last 12 months, whether he can reproduce that is 50-50 with me. I'd love to see him do it. He's a great lad and a really good player for me. I really enjoy watching him play on his day. But you know what? He's got a lot to do next year. He's got that UK Open, of course. Obviously, the World Series doesn't go into the rankings, but a couple of Pro Tour wins, I believe, as well. And so there's a lot of money to defend, and we don't know how many Pro Tours and everything we're going to get. Obviously, we hope we get the maximum amount of Pro and Euro Tours, but with the way the world is, that's not a guarantee. So a lot of money to defend for Nathan Aspinall, and the Premier League is where you can build some form on a weekly basis, and it's very important for him.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's a very interesting complexion to the Premier League this year because, like I say, it's almost you could have Cross, Aspinall, even D'Souza and Vandenberg if they don't perform well in 2021, kind of going out, and then you've got four names who won't be in the Premier League. Um, Ultimately, there's probably going to be one player out of that lot at least who kind of performs and gets to the playoffs and kind of claims this spot already, but. Yeah, ultimately, it's going to be like you say, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, and whether in terms of Aspinall, whether he can reproduce his form. Like you say, he's a great player on his down. I'm the opposite with Aspinall. I'm not, as you know, I don't really find him enjoyable to watch. He's not really my cup of tea, but I can kind of I can see why other darts fans do enjoy watching him, but. Yeah, there's going to be a pivotal year for him, like you say, with the defending money. Rob Cross even more so with the amount of money he has to defend. He has 2 major tournaments to defend. He go up a final, a few European Tour finals. He's got, I believe, near. I'd hazard a guess at nearly $500,000 to defend in terms of prize money. So he could do an Adrian Lewis and absolutely plummet down the rankings come the end of next year and so he's got to kind of refocus now, especially with him going out of the World Championships quite early. He's got that time now until the Masters to kind of, instead of a lot of players who will go into that event in Milton Keynes and almost tinker and play about, and most of them have just been on holiday, which of course you can't really do at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if Cross goes. He basically goes for it at the Masters and potentially goes all the way in Milton Keynes, because we even saw it with Michael Smith last year when he got all the way to the final of the Masters after a poor run at the World Championships. It can be done. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year on all fronts, including the Premier League.
Yeah, and we have to talk about that last spot in the Premier League. There's a few names in the running that are all mentioned by Matt Porter following the World Championship final. Dave Chisnell's in there after probably in my opinion, the best performance of the year in beating Michael Van Gerwen 5-0 in the World Championships. There's not many people that can say they've done that before. That game, he'd only been whitewashed once at the World Championships, and that was Phil Taylor in, I believe, 2012. Could be wrong there. So Dave Chisnell's got to be up there with the form he showed in the World Championship, reaching the semi-final stage. A player which I'd love to see this year, but I think it probably comes a year too soon, is Dirk Van Dyken. Reached the Grand Prix final, put in some great work at the World Championships, but he's still only 32nd in the order of merit. And you've got to feel, as much as I'm sure the fans would love to see him in the World Championship, a little bit more exposure on the TV screen before he becomes a household name and is included in those sort of invitational events. And then the other two players that were mentioned were Michael Smith and James Wade, players we've seen in the Premier League multiple times, and players in that top 10 that you maybe in previous years would have expected to be there already. But not a great year for Michael Smith in terms of money, dropping down the rankings a little bit as well after the World Championships. And James Wade, who had a very good year and probably missed out due to the fact that D'Souza and Vandenberg won majors in 2020.
Yeah, I think personally you're looking at 2 or 3 names in terms of St Helens duo of Michael Smith and Dave Chisnell. I think they're kind of the forerunners at the moment. Both power scorers, both fans' favourites, and 2 players who've been there, done it in the Premier League, and have shown glimmers at times this year. Of course, Chisnell, I even said to you at the World Championships that he's almost gone under the radar this year. He's been performing quite well throughout the year on the Pro Tour. He hit that biggest average ever during the Pro Tour year. He's been playing some serious darts, and a performance like that came together at the World Championships. I'd throw another name in there, Joe Cullen. Ultimately, with him, he kind of had that coming of age performance against Van Gerwen, despite him losing. He should have won that game, and if I was Sky Sports, a lighter go off in my head and think, he's the amount of 180s he was hitting and the amount of finishes he was taking out. He's a player who, if you give him that exposure, if you give him that experience, he'll he might be able to take it. James Wade, in my opinion, won't happen because ultimately we've had him not included before in previous years when he's been world number 5. He's a player who it was said to you and other sections of the media during post-match press conferences that he doesn't really care about the Premier League, which I don't think is 100% true, but I think he knows that almost he's always up against it in terms of actually getting into the Premier League, that he needs to almost go and win a major. And if he goes and wins the Masters, in my opinion, he'll be in the conversation because they'll have no choice to pick him, even though it's not a ranked event. But yeah, ultimately, I think you're looking at Smith, Chisnall, and maybe Cullen. I agree with Van Dyken, whether it comes too soon. I'd love to see him in the Premier League. I think there's kind of a bit of an inkling there of a player that they kind of want to build. It's the old aubergine angle, which has been massively heightened. And it's quite funny to see how he's gone from a mental Dutchman to an even more mental Dutchman holding his aubergine going to the stage. But yeah, he's in any other year they would have potentially taken a punt on him, bit like you say with Wade, but because of the season, Vandenberg, if you would have had Price winning every single event this year, or Van Gerwen or Wright, or a mixture of them three, you ultimately wouldn't have had any choice to pick Van Dyken, Boda, Wade, and potentially even Smith. But it's what we're currently living in terms of that 10th name. I don't agree with it. I think as much as you put heightened importance on the Masters, a point that nobody seems to have been making yet is, as much as it's a PDC event, it's a Sky Sports event. It's a Sky Sports roadshow at the end of the day, and they're not really going to pick a player based off the Masters, which is an ITV event. So it's going to be interesting to see who is picked and who is picked by, because it's an interesting tournament coming up, but I don't think it has that much bearing, especially if you've got tournaments following that. If you have the UK Open before the Premier League lineup's decided, if they end up extending it due to coronavirus and we end up seeing the UK Open later in the year or later Premier League start, it's going to be a hectic summer no matter what with the Premier League this year. That's all I'll say. With it starting in April, you've got potentially, if the UK Open gets moved to May even, which could be on the cards, if that gets moved to May, you never know. And then we'll have, of course, the World Match Play, and then the Premier League goes alongside that. So I think they've ultimately got to pick a player who can balance that, and is, in my opinion, a player that's UK based as well, because and it's why Van Dyken might come too soon, because if he's coming over for all these major tournaments, he's not going to want to be in the basically living in the UK, especially when he's full-time working as well. So yeah, it's quite an interesting debate, but one we'll find out in a couple of weeks. But like I said, Smith, Chisnall, and Cullen for me are the forerunners in terms of the Premier League and that final spot.
It's interesting you make the point about it being an ITV tournament, because in previous years, when they've picked the Premier League lineup, we've seen where the picks have come from.
Yeah.
As in, we've seen these are the top 4 players. These are the 4 Sky picks, and these are the 2 PDC picks. And we've seen that on screen in previous years.
Yeah.
This year, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but that hasn't been released.
No.
So we don't know whether it's a Sky pick or whether it's a PDC pick. And I think that probably does have quite a bit of bearing on what happens at the Masters. If there's a final for a player like, I don't know, say a Simon Whitlock or a Mervyn King, somebody who's on the outside of the conversation, but probably there to be spoken about, especially in Mervyn King's case, making the Players' Championship finals final. That, of course, was on ITV as well. If it's a PDC pick, then you've got to think somebody like that's in the running. If it's a Sky pick, then maybe not. Maybe they'd revert to a more usual name in the case of a Michael Smith or a Dave Chisnall. So I think that's something that people need to think about. And I think, although I'd love to see a new name in the Premier League, like a Mervyn King especially, I think they've probably got a couple of names in their mind already, and they're hoping that the Masters is a Michael Van Gerwen or a Peter Wright or a Gerwyn Price, so they don't have to make that tough decision. So a lot of decisions to be made. Hopefully we'll end up with a 10 in the Premier League after that Masters event in the start of February. Maybe even it might roll on to the UK Open. We don't know yet. But the Premier League's got some new names, it's bound to be pretty exciting this year, and we'll have all the interviews from the Premier League coming up on Tungsten Tales.